Hello, welcome to Ms. Peepers Reading Corner. I'm Katrina, aka Ms. Peepers. Let's talk about books. Today we are doing a January wrap-up. I'm going to walk through all the books that I read in January and tell you what I thought of them. Before we start though, please do not compare your reading to anybody else, especially someone who reads enough to have a booktube channel. Whether you read 1 page or 5,000 pages, you're doing great. Reading is winning. This month I read 9 books, and my goal for the year is 85, so this puts me a little bit ahead of schedule. As I go through the list, I'll do my best to call out content warnings, but if there are any topics that you prefer to avoid or just to know about going into a book, please do your own research as well. We promote good mental health on this channel, so please look after yourself. I'd like to introduce Mrs. Pickles. Oh, no, she doesn't want to be introduced. What you doing, Pickles? You don't want to be introduced? The books that I read are a mix of physical books that I own and ebooks. I'm in my cozy fantasy era of reading, and so the first 2 books I want to talk about fall into that category. The Keeper of Enchanted Rooms and The Heir of Uncertain Magic, both by Charlie N. Holmberg. These are the first 2 books in the Wimbrel House series. The 3rd one's coming out this month, so I'm definitely gonna look out for it. Spoiler, I love these. The book follows Hulda Larkin, who is a member of the Boston Institute for the Keeping of Enchanted Rooms, and her role is to investigate houses that have some sort of magic about them. And Merritt Fernsby, who has inherited an enchanted house from his grandmother. This series has it all. It's got adventure, it's got a bit of historical fiction, it's set in the 1800s, it's got some fantasy, some romance, some magic, and it's just a good time. I particularly liked the magic system, which is simple and straightforward without being so limited as to make it boring. Magical abilities in this world are passed down through generations, and so there's a lot in here about the diluting of magic and how wealthy families try to keep the magical abilities stronger in their bloodlines. While this is a cozy fantasy, there are some descriptions of violence and child abuse and post-traumatic stress, which I think it's important to know about going in. Some of them startled me a little bit, to be honest. I did find that the author handled these topics respectfully though, and kept them relevant to the context of the story. Next is To Kill a Mockingbird by Tim Federle. Now, while everyone else was doing dry January, I was reading a book about cocktails and tabbing some that I would certainly like to try. I didn't do dry January. This is a book of cocktail, mocktail, and hors d'oeuvre recipes based on books in classic literature and a few new books as well. It includes humorous and sometimes sarcastic book reports, which are entirely up my alley. Since this book is intended to be humorous, the more serious books that are in here are described with some flippancy, which may not be everybody's cup of wine. I found it really entertaining. I also read The Shepherd's Crown by Terry Pratchett. This is the last book in the Discworld series, which I discussed at length in a previous video, so definitely check that out. In this book, the young witch Tiffany Aching has to defend her land against an invasion of elves with the help of the many allies that she's made along the way in this series. I cannot recommend this series enough. It's my absolute favorite. Continuing with the cozy fantasy, I read The Bookshop and the Barbarian by Morgan Stang. This is about a woman named Marabella who moves to the town of Leaf Haven to open up a bookshop, only to find that it has been infested by goblins. She enlists the help of a woman named Asteria to clear the place out. The 2 women face down a series of obstacles and a very full calendar of town festivals in order to make the shop a success. I had so much fun with this book, and pretty much every page just made me giggle. Morgan Stang likes to break down the 4th wall with commentary and pop quizzes even, which adds a lot of fun to the story. She also satirizes a lot of Dungeons and Dragons tropes, like seeking out adventurers in a gloomy tavern or hearing rumors about things happening in the political landscape that don't seem to have an impact on the characters at all, but turns out to be relevant later. There's also a really sweet slow burn romance between Marabella and Asteria as the 2 women bond over Marabella's love of reading, which she shares with Asteria. Switching gears to dystopian fiction, I read Shift by Hugh Howey. This is the second in the Silo trilogy. Shift is a prequel of sorts to the first book, Wool. And I really like how the author showed how we got to the events in the first book and then tells those events from a completely different perspective. I don't want to say too much so as not to spoil the first book. In this series, there has been some sort of disaster, which of course we find out through the course of the novels, that has forced humans to move underground into a massive silo. These are such good books. They're really well written and intricate. The characters feel so real and are so fully developed. Like any good dystopian novel, this highlights both the good and the bad in humanity, and how he goes the extra mile to show how both good and evil are needed to help the species survive. I would definitely check the content warnings on this one. It goes into dark directions for sure, though there's certainly hope in it as well. There is violence for sure. There are betrayals, and while I wouldn't necessarily call it full-blown body horror, there are definitely some horrific things that people go through in the course of this book. So just be aware of that going in. Really, really great series though. Speaking of horror, we have a wild ride of a horror novel, The Haunted Forest Tour by James A. Moore and Jeff Strand. I hardly know where to start with this one. It's been compared to Jurassic Park, and that's not inaccurate, but it's also not sufficient. The premise is that a forest of pine trees has grown up over this town in the desert in New Mexico, killing plenty of people, doing lots of property damage. No one knows where it came from or why it's there. And so, of course, in typical capitalist fashion, a company buys the land and starts doing tours because they found that the forest is filled with all of these monsters, cryptids, supernatural creatures, ghosts, all sorts of stuff. Why not study that while also showing it off to the public? The good news is that no one has ever been killed in the 4 years that these tours have been going on. The bad news is there's a first time for everything. This book is a gory romp. It is a Quentin Tarantino Jurassic Park. There is blood, there are limbs flying, there are people dying. So those are your content warnings. Blood, gore, everywhere. This is not for the faint of heart or in fact the faint of stomach. The story is a lot of fun though. I love the creativity of the different creatures that are out in these woods. They're mixtures of both real and legendary beasts, and the storyline as some of the characters manage to survive long enough to find out what the heck is going on and where this forest came from is actually pretty interesting, and I enjoyed it a lot. One sour note that I did not appreciate was that there is a scene where one character who happens to be overweight is really treated and described in a fat phobic way. His weight is not fully relevant to the story, and yet the authors really focus on it and harp on it, and I did not appreciate that. He's also very much a negative stereotype. He's really boorish, he's not very intelligent, he's slow to move, and he's the first to die, and it just felt incredibly unnecessary. That was just one blip though, and so it didn't fully spoil my enjoyment of the book, but I do think it's important to call these things out because there's no reason for them. Overall though, if you like a spooky, tense, gory monster story, this is probably the book for you. Continuing the cozy vibes, Rumpole and the Primrose Path is a book of mystery short stories by John Mortimer. I grew up watching British TV shows on PBS, and Rumpole of the Bailey was one of them, based on this and other books. Horace Rumpole is a defense barrister who will stop at nothing to exonerate his clients when they deserve it, and he'll be the first to tell you they don't all deserve it. If they are innocent, he makes it his mission to prove it. These stories are quiet, they are charming, and they are filled with British snark. What more could you want? All right, y'all. The book I'm most proud of having finished in January, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. I'm gonna apologize right now for my Spanish pronunciation. This book took me 1.5 years to read. It's a monster. It doesn't look that big in this edition because it's very compact. And this is the translation by Tom Lathrop. I'll do a longer form video on this because I do think it's worth taking the extra time to talk about this one. I'll just say I did enjoy this. It is highly episodic. Part of the reason it took so long for me to read it is that some parts are more interesting to me than others. That's just how it goes. But I'm very proud of myself for having finished it and glad that I read it. If this is looming on your shelf somewhere and you're wondering, should you read it? Go for it. Just do it. Stay tuned for more thoughts on this one. So that's it. Those are the 9 books that I read in January. I don't do a whole lot of TBR planning because I am very much a mood reader. so I can make a plan, put up a stack of books, not touch a single one of them. But I will talk about 3 books that I am going to read. First, if you saw my last video, you know that I opened a mystery package, an open chocolat by Joanne Harris. As predicted, I have not finished it yet, but I did start it. And I'm probably about a third of the way through. Loving this book so much. Read it before, it was years ago, and this is definitely worth a reread. This follows a single mother, Diane Rocher, who moves to a small, very Christian town to open up a chocolate shop. This book is about being yourself, no matter what society expects of you, and about putting goodness out into the world. Gorgeous story, beautiful writing. It has an element of magical realism. Beautiful book. So I'll tell you more about this when I wrap up for February. The other book that I'm definitely reading, because I finished Don Quixote a little earlier than I intended. Of course, I start another giant book. This is only 850 pages. I say only because Don Quixote is over 1,000 and I feel like I can read anything now. Big books are no longer scary. 11/22/63 by Stephen King follows a man who has found a way to travel back in time, and he decides he's going to try to stop the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So this is an alternate history, time travel sort of book. It's also got one of the best uses of a step cover that I've seen. The first cover is the front page of the newspaper when JFK was killed, and then when you open it, it's an alternate newspaper, assuming that he survived, that the bullet missed. A plus to the designer of this cover. I'm about 80 pages in, and I'm really enjoying it so far. This is going to be a fun one. And finally, I'm going to open my February book. If you saw my last video, you will have seen my stack of 12 mystery books. So let's see what we got. Okay, I'm laughing because I bought this book at the bookshop, in the same place where I bought this stack of books. This is the #1 Ladies Detective Agency by Alexander McCall Smith. So now I've got, well, now I guess I have 3 of these. Now I've got two copies of this edition. I'm still excited to read this, and now I'm gonna read it sooner. So this I will read in February. This is a mystery novel set in Botswana. That's hilarious. I'm excited. I'm gonna read this book this month and let you know what I think. So that's it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my January wrap up and a little bit of reading plans for February. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these and what you thought of them, and I'll see you in the next one.